그럼 지금부터 시티넷 사무국 개소 기념 포럼을 시작하겠습니다. 먼저 오늘 참석해주신 주요 내빈 여러분을 소개해드리겠습니다. 시간 관계상 한 분 한 분씩 소개해드리지 못하는 점 양해해 주시면 감사하겠습니다. 서울특별시 박원순 시장님, 정효성 기획조정실장님, 서정하 국제관계대사님 이하 국제관계 관련 부서 직원분들 참석하셨고요. 시티넷 메리제인 오르테가 사무총장님, 김경철 부사무총장님과 아이사토빙 부사무총장님 이하 관계자 여러분 오늘 참석하셨습니다. 국내 회원도시로서 인천시 김교흥 정무부 시장님과 수원시 및 부산시에서 참석하셨고요. 시티넷 의장도시인 요코하마시 대표로서 요이치 무로야 국제정책팀장님 자리하고 계십니다. 해외 회원도시로서 사이프랄라 인도네시아 시도아르조 시장님과 리젤 아펜디 인도네시아 발릭파판 시장님 참석하셨습니다. 오늘 포럼의 기조연사이신 벤자민 바버 교수님 자리하셨고요. 패널 토의의 좌장을 맡아주신 경희대학교 손혁상 교수님과 주제 발표를 이끌어주실 이화여자대학교 남영숙 교수님도 자리하셨습니다. 그리고 오늘 패널 토의자로서 UNS캅 도노반 스토리 환경국 과장님, 아시아재단 피터백 대표님과 서울대학교 스테판 리더하프너 교수님께서 자리하셨습니다. 캘리포니아 주립대학교와 플로리다 국제대학교 MPA 과정 참가자분들도 함께하고 계십니다. 그리고 오늘 이 자리에는 세계적인 광고 기업인 DDB 월드와이드를 설립하신 키스 라인하드 명예회장님께서 참석하셨습니다. 오늘 함께하고 계신 여러분 모두 환영합니다. 고맙습니다. 네, 오늘 포럼의 시작을 열어줄 개회사가 있겠는데요. 시티넷 메리제인 오르테가 사무총장님을 큰 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
To all the officials of the Seoul Metropolitan Government led by Mayor Park Won-sun, to mayors of Seodajan, Kalimantan, to the vice mayor of Incheon, to all the other officials present here, members of the academe, friends of CityNet. Today is a memorable day because we're having a new office, a new home after being hosted by the city of Yokohama, who is being represented here by Muroya-san. And for more than 20 years, we were at Yokohama. And last year, we had a double celebration of our 25th anniversary. And we held it in Surabaya, Indonesia, last July, hosted by Mayor Trish Maharini. And then another one in Yokohama, hosted by Mayor Fumiko Hayashi in October, where she also thanked the former Secretary General of 20 years, Dato Singh Chal, before I came in. In 1987, UNESCO, UN Habitat, and UNDP encouraged the organization of cities because it could already foresee the urbanization of the world, thus making cities the engines of growth. Today, we have seen the urbanization of half of the world's population, and the forthcoming book of our keynote speaker, Professor Benjamin Barber, and I'm so curious to read it, If Mayors Ruled the World. It reflects the power of mayors and the importance of cities in the governance of the world. Will Professor Barber be the prophet for the cities? We have seen that here in South Korea, the former city mayors of Seoul, Mr. Lim Yong-bak, and before him, Mr. Yoon Bo-seon, became the presidents of your country. More and more, city mayors become the leaders of their respective countries. And when cities band themselves together, small, medium, large, and even metropolises, a powerhouse is created. We have seen the importance of an organization like CityNet, which is the vehicle for empowering and capacitating the leaders and stakeholders of cities. It is the broker for the exchange of best practices, like city-to-city cooperation, which won the United Nations Crawl of Honor Habitat Award in 2002. Through these exchanges, we gain better understanding of other cities of different cultures, and may this be a vehicle for peace in the world. While our programs and projects have earned awards and recognitions, and we are endlessly indebted to the city of Yokohama for being our parent for all these years, we look forward to a more dynamic CityNet under the aegis of Seoul under Mayor Park. We should continue innovating and reaching out to as many cities in Asia Pacific and even across the world. We have to expand the 4 clusters that we have worked in: climate change, infrastructure, disaster preparedness, MDGs, and we have to make CityNet an independent organization financially and may not rely only on our host city, but most especially, we should prepare the cities for the future and for a better quality of life. Before I end, I would like to congratulate Mayor Park for having honest and efficient citizens. Last January, when I was here, I left my diamond earrings in the Hotel Lotte. But when I asked Ms. Joo Sung of the Seoul Metropolitan Government to see if it was there, it was found by the chambermaid, properly reported, and so I had to go to Hotel Lotte this morning to personally thank the chambermaid, Ms. Yoonja Kim. I know Seoul is not only made of one Yoonja Kim, it is made up of a whole number of honest, efficient citizens. And with that, congratulations. We look forward to a better partnership with you. Cheers.
네, 메리제인 오르테가 사무총장님의 개회사였습니다. 고맙습니다. 네, 오늘 이 자리 여러분께 서울특별시 박원순 시장님께서 환영사를 하시겠습니다. 시장님을 큰 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
Thank you very much. I congratulate you found the original one. Thank you. 반갑습니다. 서울시장 박원순입니다. 메인제인 오르테카 시티넷 사무총장님, 그리고 김교홍 인천광역시 정무부시장님, 또 요코하마에서 오신 요이치 무로야 우리 국제정책팀장님, 그리고 시티넷 사무국 계속 기념 포럼에 참석해 주신 시티넷 회원, 또 모든 방청객 여러분 반갑습니다. 아울러 특별히 포럼 강연자로 참석해 주신 벤자민 바버 러커스대 명예교수님을 비롯해서 포럼 주제 발표와 패널 토에 참석해 주신 여러분께도 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 또한 이 자리에는 캘리포니아 주립대학과 또 플로리다 국제대학에서 계시는 필드 트립 차 선생님 방문을 또 진심으로 환영드립니다. 시티넷은 인간 정주 관리를 위한 지방정부 네트워크로서 1987년 창설 이래 아시아 태평양 지역의 도시 간 정책 교류와 또 국제 협조를 통해서 환경, 보건, 어떤 지역 기반 시설 분야 등에서 지속 가능한 도시 발전을 위한 다양한 노력을 기울여 왔습니다. 이러한 시티넷 활동 뒤에는 지난 20여 년간 시티넷 사무국 유치도시로서 묵묵히 그 역할을 다해왔던 요코하마시의 아낌없는 지원이 있었습니다. 이 자리를 빌어서 요코하마 하야시 후미코 시장님을 비롯한 관계자 여러분께 감사의 말씀을 전합니다. 최근 이 환경이라든지 문화, 경제 등 사회 전 분야에 걸쳐서 새로운 해결 방안의 공유와 확산을 통해서 시민들의 삶의 질을 향상하는 데 있어서 지방과 또 지방 도시 정부의 네트워크의 역할이 굉장히 커지고 있습니다. 제가 벤자민 바버 교수님하고 어제 그런 얘기를 또 많이 나눴습니다만은 이런 중앙정부만이 아니라 지방정부의 역할도 점점 커지고 있다고 생각이 됩니다. 시티넷 또한 인간 중심의 도시를 만들기 위해서 이런 정보와 배움을 나누고 또 우수 정책을 확산시키는 이런 국제적 플랫폼의 역할을 제대로 수행해 왔다고 저는 생각합니다. 이는 협력을 통한 도시 상호 간의 상생 발전을 위해서 아주 중요한 기구였음을 알 수 있습니다. 그동안 서울시는 여러분 잘 아시다시피 한국 전쟁의 잿더미 위에서 일어나서 어떤 지속적인 도시 발전을 경험해 왔습니다. 물론 그 가운데 시행착오도 적지 않았습니다. 그렇지만 그 결과 교통 시스템이라든지 전자정부라든지 상수도, 폐기물 처리 많은 분야에 있어서 세계적인 경험과 또 기술과 이런 모델을 가지고 있습니다. 이러한 서울의 도시 운영의 경험에 대한 다양한 성과와 실패를 다른 도시들과 공유함으로써 성과의 과실을 함께 나누고 또 우리가 겪었던 실패가 다시 다른 도시들에게는 최소화할 수 있도록 저희들의 힘을 보태겠습니다. 그리고 그 과정에서 시티넷이 중요한 허브 역할을 해주시기를 바랍니다. 시티넷은 그간 요코하마시의 헌신적인 노력을 통해서 회원수를 확대하고 국제적인 규모의 단체로 발전해 왔습니다. 이제 서울사무국은 그러한 요코하마시의 노력을 이어받아서 명실상부한 아시아 태평양 지역의 대표적인 국제기구로 자리매김을 할 때입니다. 시티넷 회원도시 및 국내외 단체 등과 함께 조직, 재원, 사업 등을 한 단계 업그레이드해서 질적 성장을 이룰 수 있도록 저희들도 힘을 보태겠습니다. 시티넷 사무국 서울시대 개막이 아시아 태평양을 넘어서 지구촌이 안고 있는 많은 환경, 빈곤 등의 문제를 공동으로 대처해 나가는 대표적인 도시 간 파트너십으로 발전하는 시작이 되리라 확신합니다. 오늘 시티넷 서울 사무국 개소 포럼에서 시티넷 새로운 도약을 위한 다양한 방안들이 논의되기를 기대합니다. 저는 모든 지혜를 모으면 큰 힘이 될 것이라고 믿습니다. 참석하신 여러분과 시티넷 서울 사무국 개소를 함께 축하합니다. 즐겁고 유익한 시간이 되시기를 바랍니다. Welcome to Seoul. I'm sure this will be a great moment to write a new page of history, not only for CityNet, but also Seoul Metropolitan Government. Thank you very much.
네, 박원순 서울특별시장님의 환영사였습니다. 다음으로 요코하마 후미코 하야시 시장님과 인천시 김교흥 정무부 시장님의 축사를 청해 듣겠는데요. 먼저 요코하마 시장님의 축사를 대독해 주실 요이치 무로야 국제정책팀장님을 따뜻한 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
Good afternoon, Mayor Park, Secretary General Ortega, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yoichi Muroya, and I work for the City of Yokohama as Manager for International Operations. Thank you very much for your kind invitation to today's opening ceremony. Unfortunately, Fumiko Hayashi, Mayor of Yokohama, could not attend today, but allow me to convey a few words from her. On behalf of the City of Yokohama and as the President City of CityNet, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude toward Mayor Park and his staff for their hospitality and continued efforts for this relocation of the CityNet Secretariat. It is a great pleasure for me to extend my most heartfelt congratulations on the memorial occasion of the opening of new office of CityNet Secretariat in Seoul. Since the establishment of CityNet, Yokohama has been supporting both its administrative management and technical cooperation among member cities. We have desired to cooperate with other active member cities which are eager to take responsibility to support CityNet towards further development. And at the 9th General Council in Yokohama in 2009, Seoul expressed the intention to host the CityNet Secretariat, which is the first time ever since Yokohama showed the same intention in 1989. It is one of the biggest milestones of expanding and rising CityNet, and I respectfully appreciate the contribution of Seoul on behalf of CityNet members. Yokohama offers CityNet continued project-related support for the further development of the network and to meet the expectation of its members concerning projects. As the framework of support, Yokohama will establish a project support office named CityNet Yokohama Office. I am sure that this project support office, under cooperation with the Secretariat in Seoul, will be one of the most powerful driving forces for the development of CityNet. In conclusion, I would like to express my hope that this relocation will deepen the friendly relations among Yokohama, Seoul, and all of the CityNet members. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
네, 고맙습니다. 네, 인천시 김교흥 정무부 시장님의 축사를 청해 듣도록 하겠습니다. 따뜻한 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
예, 인천시 정무부시장 김교흥입니다. 사실 오늘 말씀 전에 송영길 인천광역시장께서 함께 하셔서 축하의 말씀 올렸어야 되는데 불가피한 일정 때문에 제가 대신 이렇게 참여하게 돼서 먼저 양해의 말씀을 올립니다. 시티넷 서울 사무국의 개소와 존경하는 박원순 시장님과 오르데카 사무총장님을 비롯한 시티넷 회원도시 대표 및 관련 분야 전문가들이 함께하는 개소기념 포럼의 개최를 진심으로 축하를 올립니다. 또한 글로벌 센터 건물의 첫 번째 입주 기간이라는 점도 큰 의미가 있다고 생각합니다. 시티넷이 그동안 교통, 주거, 도시개발 등 도시 전반의 정주 여건 개선과 재난 및 기후변화에 대비한 인간의 삶의 질 향상을 위하여 아시아 태평양 지역의 지방정부 및 NGO 단체 등 130여 개의 회원들이 서로 힘을 모아 네트워크를 발전시켜 왔습니다. 도시와 도시 간의 기술 및 정보 공유를 통해서 해결책을 찾는 C2C 프로그램, 도시기반시설, 재난, 기후변화 클러스터의 교육 프로그램 및 세미나 개최 등 시티넷의 활동과 노력은 아태 지역 도시들의 정보 공유 및 도시 역량 강화에 중요한 역할을 해오고 있습니다. 특히 의장 도시인 일본 요코하마시의 폭넓은 지원과 요코하마 사무국의 적극적인 업무 추진은 시티넷이 지역 네트워크로서 많은 성과를 거두는데 든든한 뒷받침이 되어 왔습니다. 오늘 시티넷 서울 사무국의 개소를 계기로 시티넷의 새로운 도약을 기대합니다. 서울시는 원조를 받는 국가에서 원조를 주는 나라가 된 유일한 국가인 대한민국의 수도로서 박원순 서울시장님의 탁월한 능력과 한국의 경제발전 및 녹색 성장 경험을 바탕으로 세계 어느 도시보다도 도시 간 연결자의 역할을 훌륭히 수행해 나갈 수 있으리라고 확신을 합니다. 또한 그동안 시티넷의 대중교통 및 도시간 협력 분야에 적극적으로 참여하고 지원해온 서울시의 노하우를 기반으로 이 시티넷 회원 도시들의 정주 여건 개선 및 환경 문제 해결에 적극적인 동반자가 되어줄 것이라고 믿습니다. 우리 인천시는 서울시와 근거리에 위치하여 긴밀한 협조가 가능합니다. 세계 최고 수준의 인천국제공항과 서해안 최대의 무역항인 인천항을 보유하고 송도국제도시를 비롯해서 한국 최초의 경제자유구역 개발을 성공적으로 추진하고 있습니다. 또한 UN 에스캡을 비롯한 10여 개의 국제기구가 송도에 위치하고 있으며 작년에는 GCF 사무국 유치를 통해 글로벌 녹색 환경 수도로 발돋움하고 있습니다. 송영길 시장을 정점으로 이러한 인천시의 도시개발, 녹색성장, 국제협력 노하우를 아태 지역 도시들과 공유하여 협력 체계를 공고히 하고 상생하는 네트워크를 만들어가는 데 우리 인천시도 최선을 다하겠습니다. 시티넷 서울 사무국의 개소를 다시 한번 축하드리며 시티넷이 아시아 태평양 지역 도시들의 인간 삶의 향상과 더불어서 공동 발전을 이루어 나가는 데 기여하는 견고한 공동체로 보다 발전하기를 기원하겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
네, 후미코 하야시 요코하마 시장님과 김교흥 인천시 정무부 시장님의 축사였습니다. 고맙습니다. 네, 오늘 포럼의 진행 순서를 잠시 안내해 드리도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 포럼은 기조 연설을 시작으로 주제 발표와 패널 토의로 진행되겠습니다. 기조 연설은 도시간 협력, 시민사회, 그리고 글로벌 거버넌스를 주제로 벤자민 바버 교수님의 발표를 듣고 질의와 응답 시간을 갖도록 하겠고요. 이어서 15분 동안 잠시 휴식 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 휴식 시간 뒤에는 메리제인 오르테가 시티넷 사무총장님과 남영숙 이화여자대학교 교수님의 주제 발표가 있겠고요. 이에 대한 토의와 질의의 시간을 갖는 순서로 진행되겠습니다. 그럼 기조 연설로 도시간 협력, 시민사회, 그리고 글로벌 거버넌스를 주제로 발표해 주실 러커스 대학교의 벤자민 바버 명예교수님을 단상으로 모시도록 하겠습니다. 그리고 박원순 시장님과 김교흥 부시장님께서는 임박한 일정 관계로 부득이하게 먼저 인사를 나누시고 자리를 이동하시도록 하겠습니다. 여러분의 넓은 양해를 부탁드리도록 하겠습니다.
Good afternoon. I am so happy to be with my wife Leah in Seoul this week. This is the first visit for both of us to Seoul. We have been in Asia, in China, in Singapore, in Japan, but this is the very first visit to Seoul, and it will not be the last visit to Seoul. I want to thank Mayor Park Won-soon for his invitation. You shouldn't be alarmed that he left. He met for an hour with me yesterday. He has read part of my new book, and he will be with us again tomorrow in discussion. So he is very much a part of this official commemoration of CityNet opening its offices in Seoul. I also want to congratulate everybody at CityNet. We met some of the wonderful young staff of CityNet on Monday night at dinner, and I just met Mary Jane Ortega and also the former head of CityNet. So glad that you are here, sir. And it's a wonderful marriage, I think. The marriage of Seoul and CityNet is a marriage made in the Confucian heaven, I would like to say. Also, I want to welcome and say hello to young Suk Nam, who will speak a little later this afternoon as well, and Hyuk Sang Son, who is moderating our panel. So it's so nice to be with all of you. Leah and I come from New York City. I know that CityNet is an Asian network, but when I discussed this on Monday with some of the new staff of CityNet, they made it clear that CityNet hopes to grow. And I want to volunteer. I was born in Manhattan in New York, and I would like to volunteer that Manhattan be the first Western honorary member of CityNet. And I will represent Manhattan. To talk about my theme of cities and civil society in the modern world, To you who are connected with CityNet and with city organizations and represent mayors from many Asian cities is in a way superfluous, because most of the things I am going to say I learned from you. In a way, I'm going to hold a mirror up to you and what you do at CityNet. You will hear nothing new. I hope you will only see that what you do and what you are doing is important way beyond your organization. Because the argument I am going to offer to you today, and the argument I make in my new book, is that we are entering a new period of history. And it is a period in which, after 400 years of nation states trying to govern the world, not very successfully, 400 years of nation states who have unfortunately produced as much war as they have produced peace, who have produced as much injustice as they have produced justice, and even today are producing as much inequality as they are producing equality, that the 400-year reign of nation states as the primary political models in the world is coming to an end. And this, I believe, our new century, our new millennium, will be a century of cities. This is proper, because if we look back in history, we will see that, in fact, civilization was born in towns and in cities. Yes, China had a great empire 5,000 years ago. Persia had an empire. But people lived in the beginning of time in cities, in townships, in the Greek polis, in the principality. Human beings, as Mr. Glaser, the urbanist, has said, human beings are an urban species. We are born to live together, to live in towns, to live in cities. And before there were states, before there were empires, there were towns, there were cities. And what happened in the process of human evolution is that as the human race grew and more people were there, the city as a unit of political organization seemed to become too small. In the West, in Europe, they lived in Athens and Sparta and Alexandria, in North Africa, in Thebes. But gradually, as the tribes grew and spread, they looked for larger units. Even the small democracies of the ancient world outgrew Rome and Athens and Thebes and Sparta and looked for new forms of organization. And we know that in the Renaissance and in the early modern period, a new form of political organization grew up, the nation. The French said un peuple, the Germans said ein Volk, a people. And we organize much larger political entities, nation states, around a whole people. And in the 15th and 16th century, the duchies and counties and shires of England became England and Scotland. And the provinces of France became, after Joan of Arc, France. And these new nation states were born, and within a few hundred years, the nation state became the fundamental unit of organization all over the world. And so in the 18th and 19th century, as the empires here in Asia began to change, people began to talk about a Japanese nation, a Chinese nation, a Korean nation, a Korean people, and a Korean nation state. And the cities that were at the heart of civilization became absorbed into these larger states. In legal terms, they became inferior jurisdictions of the large states. The states ruled, the cities more or less obeyed. And democracy moved from the local level to the national level. But the scale of these new states was large enough that you could no longer have direct democracy. In the small towns and principalities, people governed themselves directly. They came together in assemblies. But as the states grew, they had to elect representatives. Democracy meant not self-government, but choosing the people who governed us. A very different proposition. Because representation puts a space between the citizen and their governors. And that space has been problematic and difficult ever since. But nonetheless, for 400 years, the nation state was how we did business, it was how we did democracy, and it was how we governed ourselves not only within nations, but among nations. By the end of World War II, it had become apparent that states were no longer capable of governing the world peacefully or justly. Nationalism in Europe and in Asia had created two great global wars. In the West, it had created a Holocaust. Here, from the 19th century on, with the clash of the Japanese Empire and China and Korea, it created a series of wars and devastations, of which Korea, perhaps like Poland in Europe, has been a victim again and again. A victim of the ambitions of other states, the ambitions of other empires. But that was typical of relations between nation states all through the world. The Europeans got so fed up, so sick of their nationalism, that they embarked, as we know, after World War II on a remarkable experiment, pooling their sovereignty, trying to create a new international, transnational entity, Europe. But we have seen in recent years how difficult that is. And though I admire the European experiment, unfortunately, Europe has been more about the euro than the European, more about money than about citizens. And now Europe is in trouble because on the euro and on the money question, all the old national rivalries are springing up again, whether in Germany and Greece or in Cyprus or in Spain. Europe is a noble experiment to make states work together. Perhaps it will succeed, partly we have to wait and see. But it is clear that even that noble experiment will not save the nation state, will not save democracy. But here's the real factor that has changed now and that has brought the era of the nation state to an end. When I was growing up just 60 or 70 years ago in New York, we had New York newspapers, a New York radio station. When there was winter and a virus came, my mother would say, "Don't go to New Jersey, there's a virus in New Jersey across the river. Stay here." Today we have a World Wide Web. There is no Manhattan web, there is no Seoul web, there is no Chinese web, there is a worldwide internet. It is global in character. Diseases are no longer the New Jersey virus or the Busan virus, but rather we talk here about the West Nile virus. We talk about the diseases that come out of the hot zones of Africa. We talk about global pandemics. Disease is global. Crime is global. What happens in Mexico and Colombia and the narco states affects our children, whether they're in Seoul or in London or in Bogota. Crime is global. Drugs are global. Disease is global. Health is a global question. And of course, we know markets are global. One reason CityNet and other such groups exist is that cities no longer can have their own marketplace And Korea can't have its own marketplace. Korea is part of an Asian marketplace, which is part of a global marketplace. Markets in labor, markets in money, markets in commodities are all global today. Even war and terrorism are today global. And they're not even about nation states. On September 11th, 2001, in my city, when the terrorists brought down the World Trade Center and attacked the Pentagon, they did not come from the outside. They didn't come from Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia. Most of them had lived in the United States for at least 2 years, and for weapons, they hijacked American airliners. George Bush tried to respond by striking out to look for a country responsible. Like it was the 19th century. We were attacked. Who did it? Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Somalia. He looked for a state. There was no state. There was a global and international terrorist organization. I call it a malicious non-governmental organization. That's Al-Qaeda. It's an NGO. It's a bad NGO, a malicious NGO, but it belongs to no state. And attacking states the way you would in the 19th century to solve your problems didn't work. So terrorism and war are also global. There is no challenge we face today that is not global. Think of the most urgent problem planet Earth faces. Climate change. The melting of the polar ice cap. The rise of the ocean as a result of man-made carbon emissions. That's not an American problem. It's not a Canadian problem. It's not a Chinese problem. It's not a Korean problem. It is a global problem. And if tomorrow Korea decides to be a perfectly green country, it cannot by itself make very much difference. Even if America were to decide, that's not going to happen, unfortunately, but even if it were to decide to do something, America could not by itself make the difference. Global warming is global warming, and it's a global problem. Now here comes the dilemma. Every challenge we face then, I've named it: crime, drugs, terrorism, predatory markets, war, environmental change. They are all global in nature, and yet we still face up to these problems with 17th century, 18th century political nation states. One independent nation at a time. How can independent nations deal with interdependent problems? How can 18th century inventions deal with 21st century challenges? That is the dilemma of our time. And states try one by one, and they try through their organizations, through the United Nations, through the World Bank, through the G9, through the G20. They try to do things, but they have been notably unsuccessful. Every year for the last 15 years, and particularly the last 4 or 5 years, the sovereign nations of the world have gathered and tried to update and do a better Kyoto Protocol in Copenhagen, in Rio, in Durban. And every year those states go home and say, we can't do it. Our sovereignty gets in the way. You can't inspect us, we're a sovereign country. You can't tell us to limit our emissions, we're a sovereign country. And the most powerful states on earth become the sponsors of their own climate destruction because they are unable to take action together. And the same thing is true in many other of these areas. The disaster of 2007 and 2008, the financial disaster, was a global financial disaster because even if individual national banks and individual countries tried to do something, the problem was global. We talk now about the euro crisis in Europe, but the euro crisis in Europe will be a global problem. if the euro fails. It will affect everybody. A bank failure in Mexico City or in Moscow can affect people in Nairobi and in Jakarta. That is the nature of our interdependent world, and we do not have the interdependent institutions to deal with it, and it does not look to me like independent sovereign states invented for a different world are going to be capable of solving that problem. And if that was the end of the story, I would have to say we should all go out and get some sake and have a good time tonight, because we don't have much of a future. But fortunately, that is not the story. And here's where I come full circle back to where we started this journey with cities. Because men and women still and more than ever live today in cities. Just last year, for the first time, more than half of the human population live in cities. And in the developed world, not just in the West, but in Japan and in other developed parts of the world, here in Korea, something like 75 to 78% of the population live in cities. The cities are our future. They're where we came from, but they are also where we are going. And therefore, the government of cities, the mayors who govern cities, the city councils and city managers who are engaged, and as Mayor Park would say, the citizens of cities. Mayor Park likes to say, the mayor is nothing more than his citizens, and citizens are the mayor. The citizens of cities are once again the primary potential political players in this new world. And what I want to suggest to you today is that organizations like UCLA and the American Conference of Mayors and ICLE, and they all have these strange acronyms and names. CityNet is easy to say, most of them are not. But these are the most important organizations most people have never heard of, because they are out there already cooperating across borders to try to solve real problems on the ground. And they are allowing cities to become something that's quite unique, both local and global at the same time. There's a strange English word, it's a made-up word, it's called glocal. It's a great word because it means local and global. It has the strength of the neighborhood, the locality where people live, but when you put cities together, you get something that's global, but with localities. And that means that glocality, the cooperation of cities across borders, brings the prospect of solving real problems. And in a certain sense, what I want to do today with you and what I want to do in my book, and which I think is happening, I want to change the subject. Every time we sit down and talk about problems, we say, what's America going to do? What's China going to do? What's Russia going to do? What's Korea going to do? I want to stop talking about states and start talking about city. What's Seoul going to do? What's Shanghai going to do? What's Suzhou going to do? What's San Francisco going to do? What's Kinshasa going to do? What's Jakarta going to do? Those are the political units that are capable of taking action. They are not just where we live, they are where we grow up, where we are born, where we are educated, where we work, where we make art, we make love. We get old and we die. They are the human places. And their governments are near to us, not far away. Mayors have a capacity to face up to the new problems that presidents and prime ministers find much more difficult. When we change the subject from nation states to cities, we change the subject from prime ministers and presidents to mayors and city councilors and deputy mayors and the citizens from the neighborhoods who choose them. And we are joining together again where people live and how they are governed. Because that separation, which the big nation state caused, created a crisis for democracy. Some call it the iron law of oligarchy. You elect someone, he's one of you, and then he goes off to the presidential palace, he goes off to Beijing, he goes off to Washington, and within a year or so, he's part of some elite. He doesn't represent us anymore. Our chosen representatives over time become oligarchs. And it's hard to hold on to them. But mayors can't do that. Mayors remain neighbors in a way that presidents and prime ministers cannot. And the mayor as neighbor is extraordinarily important because he has to be in touch with you. Mayor Park Won-soon came this afternoon. He sat with us. He talked to us. He said, "Excuse me, I've got to go do some business. I'll see you tomorrow." Did you see any armed guards? Did you go through a machine, a metallic machine, to get in here? If the president had been here, we drove up today to the Blue Palace, beautiful, but surrounded by wires and guards and machine guns. That's what happens at the presidential level. But mayors are our neighbors. They're part of us. They're a different kind of representative. And when you start talking about cities as the primary political players in the new world, you talk about what mayors bring to the table as political agents. Let me say a few words about mayors, because mayors are really extraordinary figures, and they're very different than the figures in higher office. And while I know a couple of Seoul mayors have gone on to be presidents in a rather small state, in most countries, mayors stay mayors. They don't go on. Let me tell you an amazing thing. Never has a mayor of a large city ever become president of the United States. Not once. Governors, senators, representatives, businessmen, generals, yes. Grover Cleveland was the mayor of Buffalo for a few months and then became president, but that had little to do with it. Calvin Coolidge was the mayor of Northampton, Massachusetts, about 20,000 people for a year. But no New York mayor, for example, has ever become president. Many, some at least, have wished they could. But they haven't. And that's partly because a mayor is a different kind of politician. Prime ministers and presidents must be ideologues. They must have a party. They must have high principles. And I don't say that with affection. Not those kind of principles that they have. Their principles are principles to go to war over, principles to say you're different over. Mayors don't have so much time for big principles because they have to solve problems. Teddy Kollek, the mayor of Jerusalem for many years in the 1970s and the 1980s, he was a Zionist, he was a good Jew, but at that time, Jerusalem had Christians and Muslims and Jews, and his job was to govern in a way that met all of their needs. And after a while, he got tired of the rabbis and the priests and the imams arguing with one another, and at one point they were all in his office, and they were talking about access to the holy sites, and they were arguing, and they were talking theology, and who really owned the old book, and was Abraham the father of Islam, or the father of Christianity, or the father of Judaism. The remarkable thing is Abraham was the father of all of them. But you know how brothers quarrel. And they were arguing, and Mayor Kollek turned to them and said, "If you will stop preaching your sermons to me, I will fix your sewers and pick up your garbage." That's what the mayor has to do. He has to pick up the garbage. He has to keep the metro running. He's got to keep the buses. He's got to make sure his citizens have jobs. He may be a socialist, he may be a capitalist, but he better employ his citizens and have jobs for them. And if there are no jobs, maybe he'll have to create some through the city. He's got to do that. He may believe that immigration is a good thing. He may believe that immigration is a bad thing, but he will have in his city many, many immigrants. Maybe they're legal, maybe they're illegal, it doesn't matter. He will have to find jobs for them. He'll have to ask, can their children go to school or not? What happens when they get sick? Do we say, you're illegal, you die in the street? He has to answer the hard questions. He has to solve real problems. And so the mayor is always a pragmatist, a problem solver. Mayor Bloomberg in New York, Mayor Johnson in London, Mayor Park here. Of course, they have political beliefs. They're on the left, they're on the right. But in the end, most of them are more independent than anything else because their obligation is to their city, to their neighbors, and to solving the problems of the cities. And like Tony Tan in Singapore, who I spent some time with last year, they will say, I said to him, is your housing program socialist or capitalist? He said, well, I don't know what you mean, because I guess it's socialist in that we guarantee housing to everybody, but it's capitalist in that we bring in developers to build the buildings and sell them to the people who are there. And it's socialist because we guarantee everybody a place to live, but it's capitalist because they get to buy them and sell them their own places. And his solution doesn't really fit the ideological categories. Maybe we talk about private-public ventures, but what he did is take a small nation of 5 million that 60 years ago lived really in the feudal world and made it a global powerhouse, but also a place of extraordinary social justice in health and in education and in housing through finding practical solutions. And Lee Kuan Yew did that, and now his successor is continuing to do that. And we in the West don't know what to make of Lee Kuan Yew because, well, he seems to be an authoritarian, but he seems to solve a lot of problems. And we don't like that he bans chewing gum because we like to chew gum. We like to let people do whatever they want. But the health standards in Singapore are higher than in the United States. So what do we think? What do we think about that? Well, I think when I talked to Tony Tan, he said, these categories don't really matter to me. My job is to fix the problems with the citizens of Singapore and make Singapore a healthy, educated, productive nation-state, city-state. Singapore is amazing because it's really a city-state. It's a state and a city at the same time. So it's a model of what we are talking about. You know, presidents operate big. If you go to the White House, Mrs. Obama, who's great, she believes in gardens and so on. She has a garden on the front lawn or the back lawn of the White House. But Mayor Park has a garden in his office. I saw it yesterday. He's literally growing food in his office, both because he thinks it proves to people everybody can have their own little garden, even an indoor garden, but because the scale is smaller, because he operates the way we would. He thinks in terms of the actual realities of what it means to have urban farming, urban gardens. And he doesn't ask, is this good or bad for industrial agriculture? He asked, is this how we can get more food into the city and make agriculture relevant to the urban environment? So it's a very different thing. And when you talk to people, it turns out most people, though in the abstract, they get very angry and they'll have an argument with you about ideology. Most ordinary citizens want to see the problem solved. President Clinton, with whom I worked in the 1990s, tells a wonderful story. He went to Shanghai at the end of his presidency. And he went on Shanghai television with the local mayor. And they had a call-in show. It was a novelty. People could call and ask questions. And everybody was prepared to have President Clinton overwhelmed with questions. That everybody would want to know, oh, President Clinton, let's ask what he thought. 3/4 of the calls, 75% of the calls were for the Shanghai mayor. What happened with the subway last week? Why have the rents gone up in my district? They wanted to talk to the mayor, even though this so celebrated American president, who everybody loves, was in town. And of course, not only do they want to talk to the mayor, they can talk to the mayor, and they do talk to the mayor, and they do talk to the city council, and they do talk to the district managers, because they are all neighbors, and they live in the cities, and their children have to go to school in the cities. And Mayor Bloomberg has a lot of money, but he takes the subway regularly to City Hall. You might say, well, that's partly a demonstration, but actually, if you know New York, it's much faster to take the subway downtown. Probably here, too, it's faster to take the metro if you're going a long ways than to try to drive in the traffic. In Newark, there's a well-named black mayor named Cory Booker. In the last 2 years, once he intervened and stopped a mugging. He jumped out of his car and stopped someone from being mugged. Another time, he went by and saw a fire. He got out and went inside and took out 2 people who had been felled by the smoke. That's not because he was particularly brave. It's what, as he said, any neighbor would do. But imagine a president or prime minister doing that. The Secret Service wouldn't let them. They wouldn't permit them, and nor would he be driving by in a local neighborhood. But mayors are part of the neighborhood. They're us. For those of you who know colloquial English, you know, we have a phrase that comes from the black community. When you see young black men, they're kind of walking like this, and they have their hoods on, and they're walking around. They're called homeboys. They come from the neighborhood. They belong to the neighborhood. I like to say mayors everywhere are homeboys and homegirls. You know, they're from the neighborhood, or as we would say, from the hood. You know, they're part of the neighborhood. They're a different kind of politician as a result. So this is a level of government where problems have to be solved, and they do get solved. The mayor of Philadelphia said not so long ago, looking at the paralysis in Washington, D.C., and the way in which the national government was not getting very much done. He said, this is Mayor Nutter of Philadelphia, he said, we could never get away with the stuff that goes on in Washington, D.C. You either fill the potholes or you don't. The pool is open or it's not. Someone responds to a 911 emergency call or they don't. You have to get things done. The trouble is, in the Capitol, in the Prime Minister's office, you don't necessarily have to get things done. You have to get elected. But once you're elected, getting things done is not necessarily part of the job description. And in an awful lot of world capitals, not very much is getting done on the global problems we face. On global warming, little is getting done. On the overweening power of banks, very little is getting done. On the global narcotics trade, very little is getting done. On the abuse and discrimination against women and children, very little is getting done. But mayors have to get things done. The citizens in towns have to get things done. That's where whatever we can get done gets done. But here's now the other side, and then I'll finish up. The other side of the equation. It's not just that cities function and states are increasingly dysfunctional. It's that cities also can work together across borders. They lack the most significant characteristic of nation states: sovereignty. Sovereignty is a great thing. It is the power to legislate and make laws on behalf of your people and to take orders from no one else. It was the great virtue of the nation state, and today it has become the great vice of the nation state, because sovereignty is paralyzing nations. Sovereignty is why America will not let monitors come and inspect emissions, because you're not allowed to do that. Sovereignty is why many nations will not allow their soldiers to work on global genocide, because they will not post their soldiers to a command of a foreign commander. That infringes our sovereignty. Sovereignty is why people want to use their own currency and not a global currency. The strength of the state becomes its weakness. Cities are not sovereign. They don't even have power in the old sense of the army. What they have is the capacity to solve problems and then cooperate with one another to actually get things done. And the existence of CityNet is the perfect example. You can tell me, those of you who work with CityNet, whether members of your association said, oh, I can't join CityNet, we're a sovereign city. They don't talk that way. Cities don't worry about their sovereignty. They worry about fixing their problems, and if they can do it better together, then they do it together. And that's exactly what they are doing. And let me give you a very concrete example, too, because I started by saying the most urgent problem we face today is climate change, global climate change. And states have done next to nothing. But cities are working together. And here's a simple fact. 80% of carbon emissions come from cities. And that means if cities want to take action in their own neighborhoods, they can. If they want a bike share program that reduces automobile traffic, they can do it. If they want a pedestrian zone that closes off cars, they can do it. If they want to modernize a port facility the way Los Angeles has recently, they can cut port pollution by 50 or 60%. If they want to paint their roofs white to reflect the sun, they can create much better insulated buildings. If they switch to alternative energy for their residential and business plants, or if they insulate their buildings better so the heat or the air conditioning doesn't leak out, they can save a lot. And since cities together are responsible for 80% of emissions, that means they can make a substantial difference. Seoul and Shanghai and New York and Mexico City can take major measures to curb carbon emissions, even if the nation of Mexico and the United States and Korea and China refuse to do anything nationally, to subscribe to a new Kyoto protocol. Not only can they do it, they're doing it. And a number of cities have made remarkable progress, and there are organizations like ICLAI and like the C40 and like ECHO Europe, where cities are working together to share best practices and share with one another what they're doing. Here's how we did it. Why don't you try this? So when I talk about mayors ruling the world, I don't mean a group of mayors is going to become the new Mussolini or the new Japanese emperor and start giving orders and telling the rest of the world what to do. I mean that if mayors can meet regularly, as they already do in these hundreds of city organizations, perhaps they can meet in a single global parliament of mayors and together begin to figure out how they can share their best practices, how they can recommend to other cities solutions to their common problems. And when you do this, you don't have top-down imperial government. You have soft governance. You have government by recommendation, government by consensus. You have cities suggesting to one another the world over how they can fix things. And the cities that want to saying, okay, let's do that. It's a soft form of governance. It's not the same as saying, here's a law, obey it, or you go to jail. But it's actually a form of governance that works because it is bottom-up. And because it's bottom-up, and because it depends on cities participating and complying, it is deeply democratic. It brings democracy back to its roots, participation. And there are a number of exciting experiments going on in many cities that are making cities and cities working together more democratic. I'll just mention two of them. One is called participatory budgeting. Cities that they started in Puerto Alegre in the 1960s, and now you find this happening in many cities, from Chicago and San Francisco to London to Asia. Cities are saying, we'll take 5% or 10% of our budget and we will turn it over to local district councils, and those councils will go to the people and say, how do you want to spend the money? Want to build a school? Your choice. Want to build a hospital? Your choice. Want to hire more crossing guards so children don't get run down by cars? Your choice. Want to do something with gardening? Do it. It's your choice. Why don't you citizens make the decisions that we officials have to make? You'll see it's tough. It's not so easy. Then you can criticize yourself, not us. But get involved in the process. What is the most important thing you do when you're a government official? Figure out how to spend the money. Where do you put the money? So let citizens do that too. Invite them in. We want you to help. We want your decision making, and you'll see it's not so easy, but you'll take responsibility and you will do it. So this new idea of participatory budgeting is a powerful way to engage citizens in government. And of course, if cities are making their decisions with participatory budgeting, maybe a global parliament of mayors can have a budget where it puts some of its money aside for decisions that come bottom up and not top down. Cities can strengthen democracy, and stronger and more democratic cities can make a stronger and more democratic global form of governance. We already have a series of potent, creative intercity organizations. But the trouble is they're here and they're here and they're here. And what I want to suggest is that we need a network of networks. One that allows these networks to work together. CityNet's a great operation here in Asia, and there are dozens like it around the world. But where can these organizations work together? Where can all cities come together and begin to share their experience globally and also face up to genuinely global problems? And it's not just things like climate change, by the way. Even crime, even terrorism can be addressed this way. I'll tell you a small story about my city, about New York City. After September 11th, when Giuliani was mayor, he sent a small squad of New York detectives, the intelligence gathering squad. There were about 12 of them. He sent them to Washington. They joined the Homeland Security Department. They worked with the FBI and the CIA. After 2 years, they came back to New York. By that time, Mr. Bloomberg was mayor. Ray Kelly was the police chief. And they said, this is hopeless. We spent 2 years in Washington. There's no information about terrorism in Washington. Besides, the FBI doesn't talk to the CIA. CIA doesn't talk to Interpol. Nobody's learning anything. What are we going to do? And Ray Kelly and Bloomberg made, I think, a brilliant decision. They said, we don't have to go through Washington. Let's work city to city. And they sent their 12 intelligence detectives, one to Hong Kong, one to Singapore, one to Rio, one to London, one to Frankfurt. They went city to city to city. And one reason New York has been relatively safe, despite the threats it has faced, is that it has probably the best intelligence squad, and intelligence is where you learn about what's going to happen and prevent it, of any city in the world, because it is working city to city. It's not going through Washington. Even Mayor Bloomberg said last year at a speech at MIT, he said, Washington doesn't much like New York, but we don't care. We have our own police force that is one of the largest armies in the world. We have our own relationship with the UN here in New York. We have our own trade relations with the world. We solve our own problems. We don't actually talk to Washington very much, and Washington doesn't like it, but that's too bad because we're fixing things here in the city. And increasingly, as you know, New York is working with other cities as well, not just American cities, but other cities. And many cities are doing that. They're working with one another. They're bypassing. They're going around the state. The state doesn't always like it, and sometimes the state comes back in the courts and it sues, and it says, you can't do that. Washington, D.C. said that citizens voted they don't want guns allowed. So the NRA brought a lawsuit, and a federal court said, you can't do that. You can't stop guns in Washington. So the federal courts can still have an effect. You can't always go around the state. But increasingly, as more and more people in the world live in cities, they can, through their elections, create national governments also that represent. And they can also resist. There's a group of towns in New England that call themselves rebel towns. And they are basically saying to the state, we're going to resist what you do. In the courts, yes, we might lose, but we're going to resist. We're going to use civil disobedience. And it may be in some cases cities have to use civil disobedience and say to states, we will not let you destroy the planet where our children are growing up. We will resist. But for the most part, in fact, states welcome cities that can solve problems because responsible national politicians want to solve problems. They just find themselves in positions where they can't do it. So in fact, what cities can do, what mayors can do, and what citizens can do in these cities of the world when they work together is remarkable. And we see a great circle closed. We start human civilization in the polis. Perhaps we will finish in the cosmopolis, in a global world where cities are primary actors and the citizens of cities in a position to solve problems not just for their own towns and cities, but for the planet. That together cities can do what states have been unable to do alone. And this is the promise of mayors. This is the promise of citizens in cities. And it is particularly the promise of these remarkable intercity organizations like CityNet that are finding ways for cities to cooperate and do things together even better than they can do them one by one. And that's why I find this wonderful marriage of CityNet and Seoul so remarkable, because Seoul has become one of the great Asian cities, a city that for a long time embodied the possibilities of radical and fast economic change, and now with Mayor Park and the citizens here beginning to think about happiness, a good life, culture, also thinking about how Seoul can become not just a great economic tiger, but can become a cultural pussycat, a place where people enjoy living and make their life, as so many people do in cities around the world. And having CityNet in Seoul as a model not just for Asia, but for the world, can help us think about what it would mean if, in fact, mayors were, in the coming years, to rule the world, to govern the world with their citizens through democratic means in ways that would solve the problems that states can no longer solve. That is a real promise, and I want to end by saying something about our young people, because you know, here in Seoul, in the United States and in Western Europe, young people are cynical about democracy, and they're pessimistic about the future. If democracy is the best last hope and democracy doesn't work, what do young people have to look forward to? And a lot of them, whether it's Occupy Wall Street or economic cynics, simply don't believe in the future. But when you think about the city and what it can do and what the citizens of neighborhoods can do, it gives new hope. It breeds new optimism about the possibilities of democracy. And it reminds us of what Thomas Jefferson said over 200 years ago: the remedy for the problems of democracy is more democracy. And more democracy in the cities, more democracy among cities, more democracy in a global governance institution rooted in cities and their citizens is truly reasons for optimism for the young and for the future. Thank you very much.
네, 고맙습니다. 잠시 기조연설에 대한 질의응답 시간을 갖도록 하겠는데요. 혹시 질문 있으신 분께서는 손을 들어주시면 감사하겠습니다. If you have any question, please raise your hand.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barber. Very interesting speech there. Would be, oh, no, it's on. Okay, thanks. Hi, thank you, Mr. Barber. Very interesting. My name is Susan Salz. I'm with ICLAI, so thank you also for mentioning us there. Very, very interesting. I actually have lots and lots of comments and questions, but to also give a chance to other people, let me focus on two questions. And these might be a little bit critical questions, but I hope in the spirit of asking critical questions to make a good idea maybe even better, I hope that that is okay for you. So my first question would be, and I agree with the sentiment and the reason for your developing these ideas, one question would be, if we have a parliament of mayors, how would we make sure that the people and the territory in the world that is outside of cities is nevertheless represented by this new form of governance? Secondly, I fully agree that nation states have also caused some problems and have not solved nearly all of the problems in the world, yet I do think they do have a role. So if we have a parliament of mayors, would this be in parallel to still the United Nations as a form of countries? Also, some people might make a speech a little bit like yours, but focus on CEOs and the power of big global corporations and what they achieve in the world. Others might talk about civil society and the large NGOs in the world and what they can achieve. So how could this Parliament of Mayors work with other big organizations and individuals representing also important constituencies in the world?
Those are great questions, very important questions. And in the next 2 hours, I will answer them one by one, because they, in fact, go to the heart. I should say this is a 1-hour slice from a 400-page book in which these questions are absolutely central, and I deal with them. Let me just hint now a little bit at answers, to them. Let me go backwards. Start with your what about CEOs, NGOs. First of all, obviously, cities work in public-private partnerships. Civil society and NGOs are an extremely important part of this. I write about them. I write about their relationships. CityNet, for example, has about 40% of their members as associates, many of which are NGOs. So CityNet is an organization that actually includes NGOs in it, and I think some others do that as well. So in talking about cities, I don't mean to exclude those. Same with the business community. I do have a particular problem, though, with both NGOs and the business community. Neither of them are democratic in the sense that they are voted for by people. NGOs like to think they're democratic because they often have democratic purposes. But their infrastructure, they're self-selected. They are not voted for. They have, and we might like what they do, but they're not democratic in that sense. And of course, while corporations have a democratic structure with respect to their shareholders and their stakeholders, they do not embody and represent the will of the people particularly. So while they are important partners in the process, they cannot be seen as the central democratic entities. But I think the even more important question that you raise is the question of representation. It's true that half the world lives in cities, 3/4 of the world in the developed world live in cities, but a lot of people don't live in cities. So if mayors govern the world, what happens to them? Well, two things. First of all, I have talked about soft consensual governance. I'm not talking about clearly mayors or nobody else are in a position to tell people what to do, say these are the laws, and if you're a farmer, you go to prison if you don't obey the law we face because you live in the countryside. So in part, there's nothing to stop, for example, rural communities from saying, let's have a parliament of rural communities and their representatives. Second of all, with respect to representation, there's no question that a global mayor's parliament would have to take a somewhat trusteeship approach and say, we can't just represent urban citizens, we have to represent the good of the planet. And in fact, most of the questions from terrorism to climate change to immigration do affect everybody, and the decisions that were taken and complied to by cities would presumably be decisions that had been put through the test of trusteeship. Do they apply to, are they effective decisions for others? But I think the real point here is that cities are democratic organizations capable of creating intercity networks. We already have those, and I'm simply talking about taking them to another level. Do they displace or eliminate the nation state? If a global mayor's parliament said tomorrow, states no longer exist, nothing would change. States are here to stay. Of course they are. They are going to be major players. They have the power, they have the armies, they have the courts, they have the jurisdiction. We're not talking here about one displacing the other. We are talking about a new complementary, or call it supplementary, level of governance. in which an awful lot of the world's people, through their chosen representatives, are getting together and saying, here are some solutions. My hope would be that a lot of states would say, this is a good idea, and we'd like to be part of it. But this is not a suggestion that states disappear. It would be very foolish, even if it was a suggestion, that I could suggest such a thing, because states will not disappear. They are here. They will stay. And the question you raise really is, what will the relationship be between a mayor's parliament, the United Nations, sovereign governments, and particularly, and here's where the real issue is, between the cities and the states to which they belong. What will the relationship be between the new transparent city hall, downtown Seoul, be with the presidential blue palace up the road? You know, that will be the question. What will the relationship between New York City and Washington be, or the relationship between Washington as a city to the federal government? Those questions will be very, very crucial to this. So we're looking at a complementary or supplementary set of institutions, at least initially. If one day people decide cities are doing it so well we don't need states anymore, that will probably be, I won't be here, maybe you'll be here if that were to happen. But that's not the goal. The goal is to try to take something that's already happening, meaningful and real cooperation, and take it to another level and see, you know, how that affects our problem solving and how that affects the other institutions.
네. 다음 혹시 또 질문해 주실 분 손 들어 주시기 바랍니다. 네, 오케이.
My name is Vijay Jagannathan from the World Resources Institute. Thank you for a very inspirational talk. But I thought one point which also needs to be emphasized is that the cities in Asia are having what one author talked about as collapsing of time and space together, in the sense that there's this enormous generation of wealth taking place, and along with it, institutions haven't developed to the same extent as the amount of money which is being generated. My favorite example is Jakarta. Metropolitan Jakarta has the GDP of Belgium. But if you look at institutions in Jakarta, they're not obviously at the same level in terms of transparency and accountability. So one of the dangers of just talking about this, the city as you know, in the Western model in Asia is that sometimes we lose track of the fact that building the institutions, or what is called the non-structural part of city development, is a lot more difficult than laying out the sewers and the traffic lights and other things. And I think that is where cities like Seoul and Yokohama have a lot to offer to the mega cities in the rest of Asia.
Again, thank you for a very important point and a very important question. And let me say again, Mike Davis has written a book called Planet of Slums. And we know that a lot of the world's megacities, not just in the developing world, are filled with slums and deeply inegalitarian, unequal. And if my proposal for a parliament of mayors is going to be meaningful, I certainly don't want a parliament of slums. And you know, that could be what you're talking about if we can't solve some of these infrastructural problems. So inequality is as big a problem, or perhaps a greater problem, in cities than it is in other places. So to talk about cities isn't to pretend that all of the big problems disappear. As you say, they stay, and as you rightly point out, very often the problems are much larger than the civic infrastructure that is in place to deal with them. And I agree with you that Asian cities particularly are examples of places that have begun to deal with them, not all of them equally successfully, but they've begun to deal with them. And I do talk in the book a lot about these things, and I agree that you can't have one model of a city, the Western model. By the way, there's plenty of corruption and plenty of inequality in Western cities. About half of the former mayors of New Jersey are in jail today, so you know, we don't live in a country that is oblivious to those problems. But there are things that we can learn. I agree with you. And one reason that I hope that CityNet grows into a global parliament of mayors is that we need to learn from Seoul, we need to learn from Jakarta, we need to learn from Singapore, and you need to learn from Bogota and from Mexico City. And by the way, the one place I want to disagree with you, there is a relationship between the small things mayors do and the big things. Mayor Antanas Mokas of Bogota. He's an amazing character as a mayor. He worked and borrowed from some other Latin American cities to develop buses that work like surface subways. They have dedicated lanes. They have, cars can't go them. There's a thing on either side. Where you stop, it's like a subway stop, a metro stop. You get in and out, and they go very fast. When he did that, he helped solve the employment problem, because buses that took 3 hours to get across Bogota now took an hour, which meant people could go from the favelas and the poor slums to the places where the jobs are, and they could actually do it. So efficient transportation turned out to help. It didn't completely solve the employment problem, but it helped to solve the employment problem. So often when you address issues of housing and education and transportation, it turns out you are addressing issues of economic inequality, issues of unemployment as well. But your basic point that inequality and corruption are also built into cities, and cities are not always, don't yet have all of the solutions, some more than others, and that we have to learn from one another. Those are powerful points, and another argument why CityNet or a global mayor's parliament would be so important, so that that experience could be shared among cities, and Bogota could learn from Seoul, and Jakarta could learn from Rio, and so forth.
네, 고맙습니다. 네, 시간 관계상 그 2부 토론 때 질의응답을 좀 이어가도록 하겠고요. 네, 그럼 간략하게 질문과 답변을 좀 부탁드리도록 하겠습니다. Please brief question and brief answer.
Right here.
You can hear me. My colleague here, Vijay, just made an observation. I wanted to, well, it's somewhat related to what he asked. I come from Malaysia, and Malaysia, as you know, is a federal state.
Yes.
We have this problem of not institutionally, but in terms of legal framework. This is something in France they call subsidiarity. So what happens is a lot of the city's functions are not undertaken by the city. The cities don't have autonomy. And I think this is what is plaguing most of the cities in Southeast Asia, because there's a lot of paternal control by superior governments. Now, in the case of Malaysia, we have two superior governments of local government. You have the state, which is the provincial government, and then you have the federal government, which is part of the union of states. Instead of decentralizing or deconcentrating activities and role, in fact, the states are doing the reverse. They're taking away most of the functions like fire services, transportation. They're taking away part of the health services and the like. With that, the local governments are somewhat put into a state of becoming just basically clearing garbage. And half of the planning is also now not, has been concentrated in what you call regional planning and the federal planning. And as a result, the local people are not even happy paying their taxes, because they feel that local government doesn't even have the power to meet with whatever their own requirements for services and activities are. So this is, I think, a global problem, because something has to be done so that the cities can all work together in a certain amount of what you call a legal or institutional framework, where they can actually do what should be done locally, rather than what should be done locally is being done at other spheres of government.
This is, again, an important question, and it leads us to consider what I call transition problems. In the transition from the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance to the nation state, the role of local aristocrats, the role of the French Parlement, and so forth, was thrown into question. And through a gradual centralization by the Bourbons and the English monarchy, they lost their powers. We are in a situation today where the idea of central power remains very powerful, but where central power is failing to solve problems. So we need more decentralization and more confederalism, but in many places we're getting less. And it's not just in Asia. In America, too, Detroit has been bankrupted. Pontiac, Michigan is completely bankrupt. And Pontiac's police and fire and health services come from the county. They don't even do it themselves anymore, which is very much the problem that some Asian cities are facing. So you're quite right to say in places, in some cities, it's going in the wrong direction. They're losing their autonomy and they're losing their power at the very moment they need more of it. A lot has to do, as you said, with financing. I mean, Americans, you all know about the Tea Party in America. The Tea Party is a rural group who think that the cities take taxes and spend their money. The reality in America is that cities pay far more taxes out than they get revenues back, and that's true for most cities around the world. But the fact is, cities are being strangled often financially by higher bodies, the bodies to which they are subsidiary. That's going to require some renegotiation through democratic elections, and where citizens of cities insist that they retain some of their own taxes to take care of themselves so they're not robbed of the capacity to do things. But these are important transition problems. This will not be painless, and there will be a lot of tension around how much autonomy cities have or how much subsidiarity they should have. In the United States, we have an important issue that has to do with, you're telling me I should stop, and that's hard for me to do, but I will finish up and just say in the United States, in the civil rights movement, the federal government, the central government pushed for universal standards, and local governments were for racism and so on. But a lot of that's reversed today. Today, the central government often represents backwards policies, and cities, local government, are more progressive. But it will take a while for us to get that. So these are important transitional problems, and they're why we need associations like CityNet and the Global Parliament of Mayors to begin to take them on, because no city, particularly these Asian cities, they can't do it by themselves. They will need help. And a cooperative network of cities that can help each other deal with these problems of transition can help us move forward. Bottom line here is that this is not waving a magic wand. This will not solve all our problems, but when we change the subject from states to cities, from presidents to mayors, we have a fresh start on many of those problems. We can begin to look at inequality and corruption and subsidiarity in new ways that will allow us to progress forward and allow us to rescue democracy from the paralysis in which it is currently held, and allow citizens to feel once again they have, through their local municipalities and through their mayors, they have some real possibilities. So this is not the end point. It is a beginning, but it is an important beginning, and it's a journey we are already on. Every member of ICLEI, every member of CityNet, every member of the U.S. or Mexican Conference of Mayors knows that cities are on a journey that can take us forward and not backward, and that's a journey I welcome all of you to join. Thank you very much.
네, 고맙습니다.